In this lesson, you will learn how to scan and steer a table control in SAP. SAP tables and SAP grid views can be scanned by the XScan, as we mentioned in previous lessons, and steered as a table in Tosca. Let's scan the SAP table and select the relevant controls we need for our test case. Click on Select on Screen or find your table in the object tree. Once you select the table, click the button Show Content Preview to see how the table is being read by Tosca. As you can see, the first row is already defined and set to be used as the header row because the value 1 is selected by default for the header. You can define the header row or column for your table if necessary by selecting or deselecting the respective checkbox and adding the number of the header row or column. You can also see how the individual cells are defined by hovering over a cell. For example, $1, $1 is the first row in the first column after any header. In other words, second row, first column. When your table is ready and uniquely identified, save your module and close the XScan window. Let's take a closer look at this freshly scanned table in the module section. If you focus on the table module attribute, you can see that the header rows and columns are defined in the properties of the table. The table module attribute contains sub-elements which can be steered called rows, columns, and cells. To steer a table, simply drag and drop this module into a test case you're working on. You must first select the respective table control. Then, either select the row or column which contains the cell you want to steer. A drop-down of both rows and columns shows you the values that were available when the table was scanned. If any values were available in the header row or column at the time of the scan, these will be available, and/or default values that Tosca stores there too. Examples of these default values are $1, $n, $last, and so on. N represents the nth entry in the table. A $sign before a value indicates the position in the row or column, taking into account the headers. So $n is always the nth row or column after the header entry, defined when the table was scanned. For example, if I define $1 in the table and the header is set to the first row, Tosca will steer the first row after the header, or the absolute row 2. A hash before a value indicates the absolute value. So hash n is an absolute value that selects the nth entry in the table regardless of the header. You can also use dynamic values as identifiers for rows or columns. Dynamic values will be covered in another lesson. After we have specified the relevant row or column in the table that we want to steer, we now want to steer the table and enter values in it. You will select the cell itself and enter the required values in the value column. You will also need to set the appropriate action mode for each cell, depending on whether you want to input a value, store a value from that table as a buffer, to verify something, or to wait on a certain state of a property. You can select an entire row or column using the action mode input and the value select on a row or column. If the SAP toolbar provides the function select all for your table, then you can also select the entire table using the action mode input for the table test step value and the value select. If a control within a table needs to be steered, you can add an embedded control in your cell module attribute by right-clicking on the module attribute and select the type of control you want to embed. We won't cover this in this course, but you can check out our microlearning content on YouTube to find out more.